The election campaign is officially underway. There are 38 days until polling day on the 7th of May. The Prime Minister has met the Queen at Buckingham Palace to mark the end of the 5-year coalition government.
In 38 days, you face a stark choice. The next Prime Minister walking through that door will be me or Ed Miliband.
Creating higher living standards for working families, inspiring hope for our young people. These are our goals. This is our plan. Let's build a better country together.
Billed as the tightest and most unpredictable election in a generation, the balance of power may be held by the smaller parties. Hello, good afternoon and a warm welcome to Westminster and to the BBC News at 1. Formal campaigning has begun for one of the most closely contested general elections in decades. There are 38 days until the polls open on May the 7th. At midnight, Parliament was dissolved, and just a little earlier, David Cameron held his final audience with the Queen, officially marking the end of a 5-year coalition government. The campaign's starting gun is being fired by all the political parties today. So we start with the details about that. Here's our political correspondent, Eleanor Garnier.
Off for an audience with the Queen. Parliament has been dissolved and this trip to Buckingham Palace the last the Prime Minister will make before the election. No need to ask the Queen's permission. With our fixed-term parliaments, polling day's been in the diary for the last 5 years. After a courtesy visit to the palace, a last chance in Downing Street to make his pitch to the country.
5 years ago, when I walked through that black door, millions of people were unemployed, there was no economic security for families, and there were worries about whether our country could pay its debts. Britain was on the brink. 5 years later, because of our long-term economic plan and the difficult decisions that we've taken, we have more people in work than ever in our history, living standards are on the rise, and Britain is more economically secure.
The only other person who could be our next Prime Minister is Ed Miliband. The Labour leader spent the morning revealing his party's ideas on business.
It's a better plan in which a proper industrial strategy builds on the great strength of British business to deliver higher wages, higher skills and higher profits for firms and families together. And it's also a plan that won't risk jobs, exports and investment, or throw businesses into years of uncertainty by threatening to leave the European Union.
The key issues we'll hear about time and time again in this election are the NHS, welfare and immigration. But the biggest scrutiny of all will come on the economy. And so far, the continuing lack of detail on where the parties will find spending cuts and tax rises is what's fueling the argument over who can be trusted best to look after the country's finances. And it's the economy the Lib Dems are focusing on today too.
And about the very last thing that the country now needs is a lurch to the left or the right. And yet that's exactly what the Conservative and Labour parties are now threatening. Just look at the way they're tearing strips off each other this morning. The Conservatives saying they'll balance the books through excessive cuts. The Labour Party saying they'll fund public services through excessive borrowing. I don't think you should be forced to choose.
But with the polls so tight, the focus will fall on the smaller parties, who could play a huge role in forming the next government.
We want to build alliances with others of progressive opinion so that we can shake up Westminster, see sensible democratic reforms, get an alternative to austerity and get politics and policies coming out of Westminster that are not for the vested interests but for ordinary people wherever they might be in the UK.
I think on the biggest issue, the biggest concern of British voters, which is the levels of immigration into Britain, we are the only party offering a positive solution, saying we want the Australian-style points system.
The stage is set. The intense campaigning starts here. Every constituency is up for grabs and the result is impossible to guess. Another hung parliament looks likely, but over the next 6 weeks, a lot could change. Eleanor Garnier, BBC News, Westminster.
Well, throughout the election campaign, as you would expect, we'll have correspondents travelling with each party to bring you the latest twists and turns from the campaign trail. David Cameron began the Conservatives' pitch by saying voters are faced with a stark choice, as he put it, between returning him to Downing Street to carry on with the plan that's turning the country round, or electing Ed Miliband and a return to what he described as more debt. Well, let's get the latest from our correspondent Carol Walker. She is following the Conservatives and, in fact, joins me from their campaign bus. Carol.
Yes, thank you, Jane. We're underway. We're on our way to the first rally of this campaign in Wiltshire. I'm afraid David Cameron's not actually on the bus at the moment, though he is going to be for quite a bit of the campaign ahead. You heard a real sense of his core message there, talking about the stark choice which voters face between himself and Ed Miliband, talking about what he likes to call the long-term economic plan, which has brought about a reduction in the deficit, falling unemployment, growth in the economy, and all those dire warnings about what would happen to that if Labour were to win power. But that message, which he's been hammering for months, has not shifted the polls so far. He's still neck and neck with Labour. He's shown David Cameron that he's prepared to get personal too, talking about Labour as a party of hypocritical, sneering socialists, saying that Ed Miliband is not up to the job of Prime Minister. Now, when I set out on David Cameron's campaign 5 years ago, he was the new Conservative leader offering hope and a fresh start. Now he is defending a record of 5 tough years in power. This is going to be a really tight, relentless battle all the way from now until polling day.
Thanks, Carol. Well, Labour, for their part, have used the first day of formal campaigning to launch their business manifesto. The leader, Ed Miliband, says his party won't risk jobs, exports and investment, or cause years of uncertainty by threatening to leave the European Union. Our special correspondent, Lucy Banning, is in the City of London, where that launch took place. Lucy.
Well, Ed Miliband chose day one of this campaign to speak to businessmen and women, making Labour's pitch for business, saying that Labour would be better for business. This was Ed Miliband's pitch for day one of the campaign, saying that the Tories' threat to take Britain out of Europe is a threat for business, and Labour wasn't prepared to play political games for this. But there was some overshadowing of the Labour campaign, because there was an advert in the Financial Times this morning with business leaders' quotes that seemed to support Labour's position on the European Union. And the problem with that is that not all the business leaders knew that this was going to be used in a Labour campaign. So we had a situation after Ed Miliband's speech with the boss of Siemens. He was one of the leaders quoted in that advert. The boss of Siemens being chased up and down the escalators here by the media, including the BBC, and he did say that Siemens weren't happy that this had been used in a party political advert. The key question for Labour on this campaign, tax and spending, however, how much are they going to borrow? Suggestions from a think tank, it could be 30 billion. Labour saying today that that isn't true.
Thanks, Lucy. The Liberal Democrat leader Nick Clegg has promised that his party will keep a future government anchored in the centre ground. He warned that a lurch to the left or the right is about the very last thing that the country needs. Let's talk to Sophie Long, who's following the Liberal Democrats and is in fact outside Buckingham Palace, where Nick Clegg has been. Sophie.
Jane, thanks very much. Yes, the Liberal Democrat leader has been here at Buckingham Palace this lunchtime in his role as Lord President of the Council. He left here a short time ago and is now on his way to join his canary-coloured battle bus, which is on its way to that key election battleground of the West Midlands. Now, this will be a very, very different election campaign for Nick Clegg this time around. Last time, of course, they were the insurgent party picking up the protest vote. This time, for the first time ever, they'll be campaigning on their action coalition in government. Now, Nick Clegg will say this is a record that they can be proud of, that they created stability and helped rescue the economy, that they made Britain a fairer place by cutting taxes for working people. But coalition is controversial, particularly for the junior party, and that decision to go into government with the Conservatives alone cost them some of his key supporters. Then, of course, there was that broken promise over tuition fees. If there is one certainty in this uncertain election, is that it's going to be tough out there for the Liberal Democrats and their leader. They're still bobbing around 8% in the polls, and some analysts are saying they could lose as many as half their seats. The Lib Dem leader, though, says he remains upbeat.
All right, Sophie, thank you. Well, let's talk about UKIP as well. Its leader, Nigel Farage, says he's as confident as any other party leader as this campaign begins. He will announce his policies, his key policies, later this afternoon. So let's find out about that from our political correspondent, Alex Forsyth in Ramsgate. Alex.
Jane, we're on the Kent coast, which is right at the heart of the UKIP campaign, not least because this is where Nigel Farage, the party leader, will be standing, hoping to win his seat in Parliament. This morning, he said anything could happen in this election. All balls are up in the air. This afternoon, he's expected to outline some of the party's key themes. Immigration, as you'd expect, will be front and centre. The party would introduce an Australian-style points-based system. They'd also increase spending on health and defence, paid for by cutting the international aid budget and, of course, leaving the European Union. The interest in UKIP won't just be in the seats they might win, but also the seats where they might come second or third, and how support for this party could affect the other parties and how well they do. The level of attention that's expected to be paid to UKIP during this campaign is really a sign of how the political landscape has changed. But people will be watching very closely to see whether or not this party, which has grown so quickly, can withstand the pace and the scrutiny of what's expected to be a very intense campaign. Jane.
Thank you, Alex Forsyth there in Ramsgate. So for the next 5.5 weeks, the parties are, of course, trying to win our votes. Throughout the campaign, Christian Fraser is going to be taking the temperature of public opinion and keeping an eye on all the latest opinion polls. Let's find out what they're saying today. Christian.
Well, it depends which poll you are looking at, Jane, because we've had two conflicting polls over the course of the last 48 hours. The first poll, which I'm going to show you, which was published in the Sunday Times, probably had the Labour Party jumping for joy. This is an online poll of 1,800 people. Here is the margin of error. And you can see that after that light sparring with Jeremy Paxman last week, suddenly Labour eke out this 4-point lead over the Conservatives, with the Lib Dems on 8 and UKIP on 13. But wait! Suddenly along comes another poll from Comres, this one published in the Daily Mail. Again, the margin of error here. This was a telephone poll of 1,000 people, and suddenly the figures are the other way around. It's the Conservatives who are 4 points ahead of Labour, with Lib Dems up 1 and UKIP down 1. Confused? Well, yes, so am I. But really what matters is the general trend, the way in which things are going. And so we can put all these polls together in our poll of polls and show you the picture over the course of the last 5 years, since the last vote. And there are some general patterns, I think, to pick out here. First of all, this is where we were at 2010. So you see the Liberal Democrats here firmly between the two biggest parties and the minor parties. But look how their fortunes dwindle through the 5 years, from over 20% down to 8%. At the same time, you have the inexorable rise of UKIP taking a chunk out of the Conservatives. And yes, they're down a little bit here, but we all know they're going to play a big factor in this upcoming election. But suddenly you'll be looking at this and saying, hang on, Christian, you've got it wrong. Where is the line of the SNP? Well, I'll show you that in a second. But let me just show you, before I do that, the pattern of the last 4 weeks. Look how close it is now. Nothing much the leaders are saying is changing the picture. The two sides now deadlock in the poll of polls on 34%. But where is that yellow line of the SNP? Well, I'll show you a chart that we've done for you, which really pulls out the figures north of the border. And you will see, here we go, and get this to move. There you go. The SNP on 43%. This poll was done on the 23rd of March. The SNP 16 points ahead of Labour and, of course, a long way ahead of the Conservatives. These sort of figures, Jane, are the sort of figures that Messrs Miliband and Cameron can only dream of. They're locked at 34%. Look what the SNP have north of the border.
Christian, thank you. Christian Fraser. Well, let's assess the situation on this first formal day of campaigning. Our assistant political editor, Norman Smith, has been following all the day's events so far and a long 5.5 weeks ahead, Norman. And those polls are fascinating, aren't they? We go into this really simply just not knowing, not being able to predict.
I think that's true, Jane. Normally at an election, you have a gut instinct about what's going to happen. You feel it in your bones. This time, really, no one knows. Entirely unpredictable, and in a way it is because both the main parties are stuck neck and neck. This despite the fact we've actually already been fighting this election campaign for 4 months, and the two main parties have not been able to get an edge on each other. They're like sort of two heavyweight boxers who are just slugging it out with each other. Same old punches. You get the Tories going on the economy and leadership, Labour coming back on the NHS and cost of living. Neither can deliver the knockout blow, and you sense going forward probably neither is actually going to be able to get that crucial bit of momentum and lead to put them in a position of winning a majority government, which means the critical element in this election could well be the smaller parties. What sort of damage do they do to the big beasts? How many votes do UKIP drain away from the Conservatives? And what on earth do the Scottish National Party do to Labour north of the border? That may be what determines the outcome of this election. So bizarrely, we may have a very, very predictable campaign where the arguments are already well rehearsed, but the outcome entirely unpredictable.
Norman, for now, thank you very much. And let's pick up on some of what Norman was talking about there. In fact, take a look at how the election's expected to play out across the UK. We'll get the latest from Hal Griffith in Beaumaris on Anglesey, Andy Martin in Belfast. First, though, let's head to Edinburgh and hear more about that picture in Scotland with our correspondent Laura Bicker.
Well, as you've been hearing, the real battle here in Scotland is between the Scottish National Party and Labour. The SNP have 6 MPs at Westminster, but polls suggest they could be on course to take anywhere from between 20 up to 50 seats. And with things so tight between Conservatives and Labour, well, these are seats that Ed Miliband can ill afford to use. Now, the SNP have gained popularity since the independence referendum. They are arguing they will stand up for Scottish interests at Westminster. They will work, they say, to bring more powers to the Scottish Parliament. Labour, for their part, say they'll end austerity. And this morning, the former Prime Minister Gordon Brown was out campaigning in Glasgow's East End, saying they will find more funds to allocate to Scotland. Well, this afternoon here in Edinburgh, just off the Royal Mile, a 300-year-old ceremony will take place. The trumpets will herald the official dissolution of Parliament and the official start of this campaign. The SNP have only ever won 11 seats at Westminster. Could they be on course to make history of their own?
Thanks, Laura. Let's talk to our Wales correspondent, Hal Griffith, as well. He's in Beaumaris. I hope I'm getting that correct this time. Anyway, you are on Anglesey. Fill us in on the picture there, Hal.
Yeah, well, Jane, in this constituency, really across Wales, the main challenge is for Labour to not just maintain their vote from last time round, but build on their traditional dominance in Welsh politics. In 2010, they took 26 of the 40 seats in Wales. This time around, if Ed Miliband's to have any chance of getting a majority, that tally has to go upwards. But as we heard from Norman, they're being attacked from every side with smaller parties. UKIP have grown as a force in Wales in the last 5 years. Very pro-European Plaid Cymru coming in from the left of Labour, demanding more public spending, an extra £1 billion for Wales. And although they only took 3 seats in the last election, even that sort of small tally could be influential in the event of a hung parliament. What about the other parties? Well, the Tories and Lib Dems in UK government will attack Labour's government record here in Wales in the Welsh Assembly, primarily things like the health service and how England and Wales have compared in the last few years. Those issues had evolved, but the rule book is out the window when there's an election campaign underway.
Hal, thank you. Let's get the thoughts of our Ireland correspondent. Andy Martin is in Belfast for us this lunchtime. Andy.
Yeah, well, Jane, Northern Ireland has 5 main political parties, 4 of which sent MPs to Westminster last time around, only 3 of which take their seats, and only 2 of which can expect to have any significant influence over the makeup of the next Parliament. On the nationalist side of the community, Sinn Féin does not take its seats, which leaves the SDLP. It had 3 seats last time around and has traditionally voted with Labour. So the Democratic Unionist Party, which had 8 seats last time around, I think it can be confident of securing 7, a possible 8, probably 8 again, a possible 9 and an outside chance of 10. What would it extract from a Labour or Conservative government? Well, it says it will not enter a formal coalition, but it is a business-centric party and it wants to grow areas like this, the site of the former Harland and Wolff shipyard which built the Titanic, into a financial services sector. Basically, it wants help financially, and as the cuts kick in Northern Ireland in a manner that they have already done so in the rest of the United Kingdom, that boils down to more money from Westminster for Northern Ireland.
Andy Martin there, thank you. And I'll have more from here at Westminster a little later in the programme. For now, back to you, Simon.
Jane, thank you.
Thank you very much, Simon. Yes, on the day that the election campaign has officially begun, 38 days to go, let's continue to get the thoughts of our assistant political editor, Norman Smith. And the fact that it is so very close, Norman, means that the role of the smaller parties here is perhaps more significant than we've ever seen.
Normally in our elections, our first past the post electoral system basically throttles the life out of smaller parties. They pile up votes, but they cannot get seats. This time it might be different, because we have seen them enjoy stratospheric poll ratings, particularly if you look at UKIP. They won the European elections. They have consistently outpolled the Liberal Democrats. They could be poised now to win a fair number of seats. Again, the first past the post system, their lack of activists, the difficulty in fighting a national campaign, the fact they've kind of gone back in recent weeks means it's going to be difficult for them. Easier for the Scottish National Party. Why? Because they have an extraordinary activist base. They now have 100,000 members. I was reading that means roughly 1 in every 20 Scots is a member of the Scottish National Party now. So they have a huge activist base, very active on social media, and they have a record of success. They have defied the electoral system there to form a Scottish government. And that means I think they are poised to really dent Labour. So we could see for the first time the smaller parties not just gaining votes, but gaining significant numbers of seats too.
Norman, as ever, thank you very much. And worth reminding you that you can just keep up to date with every development for the next 38 days with the special live page of the website, bbc.co.uk/election live. Simon, back to you.
Jane, thank you. You're watching the BBC News at 1. It's coming up to 1:30. Our top story today, the election campaign is officially underway. Parliament has been dissolved and there are now 5.5 weeks until polling day. Well, let's return to our main story. The campaign starting gun has been fired in one of the most closely contested general elections in decades. 38 days of frenetic activity will culminate with the vote itself on May the 7th. Let's return to Jane Hill, who's in Downing Street.
Simon, thank you very much. Yes, people might be forgiven for thinking, in fact, the election campaign has been running for really quite some time. But actually, it all started officially here today. David Cameron has been to Buckingham Palace to inform the Queen that Parliament is dissolved, marking the end of 5 years of coalition government. All the parties now have 38 days to try to persuade all of us that it is that party that deserves our vote. That is all from us from here at Downing Street. In a moment on BBC One, it's time for the news where you are, but we will leave you with some of the images from today. Have a good afternoon. Bye-bye.
Her Majesty the Queen following the dissolution of Parliament. The general election will be held on May the 7th.
Welcome to BBC London News. I'm Alex Bushell. So, formal campaigning has begun in what's expected to be one of the closest and most unpredictable general elections in living memory. Labour currently holds more than half of London's 73 seats, but would need several more to form the next government. The Conservatives and Liberal Democrats will be fighting hard to stop them. And it's in marginal seats where this election will be won. Our political editor Tim Donovan now reports from one of them, Hendon.
This is about the best-known landmark in the constituency of Hendon. The RAF Museum celebrates the aerial heroics of the few during the Battle of Britain. The numbers are small in the electoral contest happening here. Just over 100 votes is what Labour needs to overturn a Tory majority, making this seat its #1 target in the capital.
In the Battle of London 2010, what was striking was that the swing in the share of the vote from Labour to the Conservatives was half what it was in the country as a whole. London remains a stubbornly Labour-leaning city, even if piloting London's own government these last few years has been a Conservative mayor.
London's election will be won and lost in 73 constituencies. 38 are currently held by Labour, the Conservatives hold 28, and there are currently 7 Liberal Democrat seats.
London may consist of 73 constituencies, but in reality it will only be about, say, 20 which can shape the outcome of this election. Those are the marginal seats. Now, there's no firm definition of what a marginal is, but we tend to regard one as being a seat where the winner last time secured a majority of 10% of the total vote or less.
Labour really needs to sweep up such marginals if it's to form a government, certainly if it hopes to be the largest party. In its sights are seats like Tory-held Brentford and Isleworth, Croydon Central and Ealing Central and Acton, as is also the Lib Dem seat of Hornsey and Wood Green. For the Tories to win a majority, you would expect them to take what they missed out on last time, seats like Hampstead and Kilburn and Westminster North held by Labour, or Sutton and Cheam held by the Liberal Democrats. And as for the Lib Dems, consistent poor polling makes some wonder whether even seats like Twickenham, Kingston and Surbiton and Bermondsey and Old Southwark, long held by current ministers and the coalition, could be at risk. It's very difficult to gauge at this stage how voters in London will help shape the outcome of the most unpredictable of elections. Tim Donovan, BBC London News.